My name is Ingrid Halvorsen and I'm 37 years old. The morning it started, I packed a folder before I did anything else. It went into the bottom of my tote bag, under the girls' snack bag and the packet of colored pencils, before I'd even poured coffee. I want to be accurate about the order of things because the order matters. The folder came first. Everything else, the invitation, the ferry, the wedding, came after. But I should start with the invitation because that's where it actually started. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot while I was still in my robe, standing at the kitchen window watching the ferry cross the gray water below. I picked it up off the floor without thinking. Cream envelope. Heavy stock. My name written in a calligrapher's hand. I turned it over twice before I opened it. It was a wedding invitation. Daniel's wedding. My ex-husband was getting married and someone had sent me an invitation. I set it on the counter. I poured my coffee. I stood there a long time looking at it, the way you look at something you don't quite believe is real. Outside, the ferry horn sounded low and long across the water. The rain had started again, the thin Pacific Northwest kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air. I could smell the salt and diesel from the harbor even with the windows closed. I read the invitation a second time. It was from his mother. Renata Halvorsen. She'd kept that name even after she and Gerald divorced, said it was her name by then, hers as much as anyone's. The return address was the same house she'd lived in the whole time Daniel and I were married. The house where I'd spent 7 Christmases, 4 Easters and more Sunday dinners than I could count. The note tucked inside was handwritten. Renata's penmanship. I'd have recognized it anywhere. We would very much like you to attend. The children should come. It would mean a great deal to all of us. The children. She knew about them. Of course she did. Word travels in a harbor town. I'd had 3. All at once. 3 girls, 4 years old now, born 14 months after Daniel and I signed our divorce papers. I'd never told Daniel directly. I'd told his sister Marta once briefly at the ferry terminal 2 years back, running into each other by accident while she was loading grocery bags into her car. She'd gone very still when I said it. She'd asked if they were healthy. I said yes. She'd nodded and driven away. I hadn't heard from any of them since. Until now. I read the note one more time. Then I put it back in the envelope and went to wake the girls. Their names were Signa, Britt and Lena. They were 4.5 and they were loud and specific and certain about everything. Signa wanted her eggs with no brown on them. Britt had strong opinions about which cup was hers. Lena carried a small boat key on a ribbon around her wrist because she'd found it on the boatyard fence 2 summers ago and decided it was hers. I'd never been able to convince her otherwise. I made eggs. I watched them eat. I thought about Daniel's face. I hadn't decided anything yet. But something had shifted, low in my chest, the way the tide shifts before you can see it move. I called my friend Daria that evening. She listened while I read the note aloud. When I finished, there was a pause. "Are you going?" she said. "I don't know. Do you want to?" I thought about it honestly. Not what I was supposed to want. What I actually wanted. "Yes," I said. She didn't ask me to explain. That was why Daria was my friend. "What are you going to do?" she said, "if he doesn't know?" "He doesn't know." "Ingrid." "I know," I said. "You've thought about this." "I've thought about very little else since Tuesday." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you want me to come with you?" "No," I said. "This is mine to do." I set the invitation on my desk and left it there for 3 days. I looked at it every morning. On the 4th day, I RSVP'd. That same evening, I took the folder, the one I'd been keeping for 4.5 years without quite admitting to myself why, off the shelf in my office closet and set it on my desk beside the invitation. I didn't open it. I already knew what was in it. I'd built it one document at a time, the way I built everything, without a plan for when I'd use it, only the certainty that I would. It had started as a single manila folder from the office supply drawer, meant to hold Signa's discharge paperwork from the NICU. Somewhere in the 2nd year it had become something else, without my deciding that it should. Daniel Halvorsen and I met when I was 26 and he was 31. I was working as a marine surveyor out of a small firm in a harbor town on the Sound, the kind of town where everyone knows what ferry you took and what time you got back. The boatyard was 2 blocks from my office. I could hear the grinders in the morning. I liked that. I liked knowing where things were. Daniel worked in commercial insurance. He covered marine cargo, which was how we met. I was on a damage assessment for a client of his, a 40-foot working vessel that had taken on water in a storm. He came down to the boatyard to review the report. He was tall, careful with his words, and he laughed at something I said that most people didn't find funny. We had coffee the next day. We were engaged inside a year. His family was Scandinavian American, 3 generations in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of family that has a specific chair at the table and a specific way of doing everything. His mother Renata ran the family like a harbor master runs a dock, quietly, completely, with total knowledge of every vessel in her waters. She was not unkind in those first years. She was welcoming in her way. But her way had edges. She asked once, 6 weeks after the wedding, whether I planned to stop working full-time after we had children. I told her I didn't. She nodded and said nothing more. But I understood the silence. His father Gerald was warmer on the surface and less present underneath. He called me the surveyor for the first year, not unkindly, more like a title he found amusing. He shook my hand at every greeting for 2 years before he switched to a brief shoulder pat, which I understood was progress. His sister Marta was the one I genuinely liked. She was 2 years younger than Daniel, quieter than the rest of them, and she had a way of looking at family dynamics with one eyebrow slightly raised, as if she were cataloging them for later. She and I would sometimes stand at the kitchen window at Sunday dinners while the others were in the living room, and she'd make one dry observation about something that had just happened, and I'd agree without elaborating, and that was enough. We were married for 4 years. The first 2 were good mostly. The last 2 were not. Daniel was not a cruel man, I want to be accurate about that. He was conflict-averse in a way that calcified over time, so that every disagreement between us became something he managed rather than engaged with. He would agree with me in private and then do whatever his mother had suggested. He did it so consistently that eventually I stopped having private conversations with him about anything that mattered, because they changed nothing. The end came quietly. He told me one evening, in the same tone he used to discuss cargo insurance deductibles, that he thought we'd made a mistake. I asked him if he meant the marriage. He said yes. I asked him if this was something he'd been thinking about for a long time. He said it was. I nodded. I asked him if he'd discussed it with his mother. He didn't answer. We filed 6 months later. I kept the house. It was mine before the marriage. I'd bought it on my own the year before we met, a small place on a hillside with a view of the water, a dockside neighborhood where the fog came in thick on winter mornings. I stayed there. I kept working. 3 months after the divorce was final, I found out I was pregnant. I won't reconstruct everything I felt during those months. I'll say that I was alone in a way that has a specific quality to it, a weight that settles into the physical, and I was also clear-headed in a way I hadn't been in years. I called my sister in Oregon. I called Daria. I did not call Daniel. The girls were born in October, premature by 3 weeks, each of them small and furious and entirely present. They spent 9 days in the NICU. I sat with them every day, all day, across 2 chairs pushed together, reading aloud from a Marine Survey manual because it was the only book I had with me and I needed them to hear my voice. A nurse named Corinne, who worked the day shift that whole 9 days, brought me a second chair on the 3rd day without being asked, and told me she'd seen a lot of parents in that unit and I was one of the steadier ones. I thanked her. I didn't tell her there was no one else coming. By the time I brought them home, I understood something about myself that I hadn't articulated before. I was not someone who needed to be received. Not by Daniel. Not by his family. Not by anyone. I was someone who assessed situations accurately and then decided what to do. That was my job. It was also, it turned out, my nature. The 4 years between the divorce and the invitation were full in the specific way that raising 3 children alone is full, without gaps, without pauses, with the continuous low hum of logistics beneath everything. I kept my surveying work. My firm had given me 6 weeks leave after the girls were born and I had taken 4, not because I was ready at 4, but because a client specifically requested my assessment on a disputed hull claim that my colleagues weren't trained for, and I was. I drove to the boatyard with the baby monitor app running on my phone and my mother watching the girls, and I did the survey and I wrote the report and I went home. After that, I adjusted. I shifted to a schedule where I handled boatyard and vessel inspections in the morning, before 1 p.m. when the ferry traffic thickened, and kept my desk work for the evenings after the girls were in bed. My mother lived 40 minutes away and came twice a week. A neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Ellen, watched the girls Tuesday and Thursday mornings in exchange for help with her dock permit paperwork, which I filed for her each spring, for separate filings across 4 years, always finished a week before the county deadline. I paid for everything myself. I kept a clean accounting, not because I planned to show anyone, but because it was my practice, the way a marine surveyor tracks hull conditions, precisely, without sentiment. The house ran on a set of calculations I revised quarterly. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, childcare, clothing for 3 growing girls, medical co-pays. The girls had been healthy mostly, but 3 children generate a predictable volume of fevers and ear infections, and one memorable incident in which Britt ate a significant quantity of beach sand and had to be seen at the urgent care on a Saturday morning. I covered all of it, every appointment, every bill, entered into a ledger I kept the same way I kept survey logs, dated and itemized. I also covered what I hadn't expected to cover: the boatyard fence repair that protected the dock access I used for client meetings, which the property association assessed to every owner on the street, my share coming to $2,200. The water heater that failed in February, 2 weeks after a cold snap, which I replaced myself with a model my neighbor's son-in-law helped me install on a Sunday afternoon, in exchange for a favor I did him the following month, drafting a simple bill of sale for a boat trailer he was selling. The van I bought to fit 3 car seats and a surveying kit, a 6-year-old model with 90,000 miles that I paid $8,400 for in cash after 3 months of setting aside what I could, $100 here, $200 there, tracked on the same spreadsheet as everything else. None of that is remarkable. I'm not recounting it to make it sound remarkable. I'm recounting it because of what came later, and because the facts of a life are the only honest record of it. What I will say separately is this: Renata knew some of it. Not because I told her. Because Marta told her, or because small towns tell their own stories. I knew Renata knew because of a phone call she made to my mother 2 years after the divorce, not to me, to my mother, in which she apparently asked whether I was managing. My mother had relayed this to me with a particular expression on her face. I'd said I was managing fine. My mother had said she'd told Renata exactly that. Neither of us said anything else about it. There had been other things earlier during the marriage. The summer before the divorce, Daniel's parents had needed help with a lien dispute on a piece of property they owned north of town, a small parcel with a dock easement that a neighboring landowner was contesting. They'd hired a lawyer, but the lawyer was a contractsman and didn't know the marine access regulations that governed that particular easement. I did. I spent 4 evenings going through the relevant statutes and survey records, drafted a technical summary for their attorney, and the dispute was resolved in their favor 4 months later. Gerald had shaken my hand when it settled. Renata had said, "That was helpful of you." I had said thank you and considered the matter closed. There was also the winter Daniel's father had a health scare, a cardiac event, not a severe one, but serious enough to require a week in the hospital and a period of restricted activity afterward. I drove Renata to the hospital the first morning because Daniel was 2 hours away on a site visit and couldn't get back until afternoon. I sat in the waiting room with her for 3 hours. I brought coffee. I drove her home. I came back the next morning when Daniel was there, made sure she had food in the house, and left without making it a conversation. She never mentioned it again. Neither did I. Marta came to meet the girls once, a year after they were born. She showed up at my door on a Saturday morning unannounced with a box of shortbread from the bakery near the ferry terminal. She sat on my kitchen floor with Signa, Britt, and Lena for 45 minutes, stacking wooden blocks and letting them knock the towers over. I made coffee. She didn't say much. Before she left, she stood in the doorway and looked at the 3 of them standing in a row, and something moved across her face that I didn't name. She said, "They look like him." I said, "Some." She nodded. She left. That was the last time I'd seen anyone from the family before the invitation arrived. On the morning I decided I was going to the wedding, I sat at the kitchen table after the girls had gone to watch their program and I thought about it clearly. Daniel didn't know the girls existed. I didn't know that for certain. But I believed it. Renata's note had said the children should come. That was not a phrase someone writes when they are assuming the father already knows. I thought about what it meant that Renata had sent the invitation. I thought about what it meant that she had written it would mean a great deal to all of us. I thought about Lena's boat key on its ribbon and the way she slept with it under her pillow. I didn't make a plan. I'm not someone who plans for drama. I'm someone who assesses the situation accurately and decides what to do when I get there. But I am also someone who documents, and the folder had been building itself for 4.5 years without my ever calling it a plan. I laid out the girls' good dresses the night before, the gray wool ones with the white collars. I checked the ferry schedule. I set my alarm for 6:15 a.m. Then I went to sleep. The ferry left at 7:14 a.m. I had the girls dressed and fed by 6:50. Signa ate her eggs without complaint, which was unusual enough that I checked her forehead. Britt found her cup without argument. Lena wore the boat key on its ribbon outside her collar, over the white wool dress, and I decided not to fight it. The key was small and brass and old, and it made her feel ready for things. I understood that. We drove to the terminal in the van. The fog was low over the water, the kind that sits in layers, the bottom layer dark with diesel, the top soft and white. A ferry horn called from somewhere out in the sound. The girls pressed their faces against the van windows and watched the dock lights. I checked my bag before we boarded. Snacks. Colored pencils. The folder, flat at the bottom, exactly where I'd put it. We boarded. I found 4 seats on the port side, the girls arranged in a row beside me. Signa fell asleep against my arm before we cleared the breakwater. Britt organized her coat buttons. Lena held the boat key in her fist and looked out at the water with the expression she always had on the ferry, serious and satisfied, like a navigator confirming position. I hadn't told them much. I'd said we were going to a wedding. I'd said it was for someone I used to know. Signa had asked if there would be cake. I said probably. That was enough. I thought about Daniel the whole crossing. Not with grief. That had run its course years ago. I thought about him the way I think about a vessel I've assessed, structurally, accurately, without attachment. I thought about what he knew and what he didn't. I thought about Renata's handwriting on that note and the specific phrasing she'd used. The children should come. Not your children. The children. As if she'd been thinking of them as a category, a variable she'd been accounting for. The terminal on the other side was busier than usual for a Saturday. I buckled the girls into their seats in the rental van I'd reserved for the return trip, checked the address on my phone, and drove east on the highway that runs along the Sound, the evergreen tree line close on both sides, wet and dark green in the morning light. The venue was a converted waterfront lodge, the kind of place that charges a great deal for the view and a little less for everything else. White chairs on a lawn facing the water. A tent for the reception. I parked in the far row, took my time getting the girls out of their car seats, smoothed Signa's collar, retied Britt's hair ribbon, checked Lena's key was still on its ribbon. Then we walked toward the entrance. I saw Marta first. She was standing near the door with a clipboard, something ceremonial, greeter duty. She looked up when we were still 20 feet away. Her face went still. She looked at the girls. Then at me. Then at the girls again. I kept walking, the girl's hands in mine, Lena's key catching the light once as she swung her arm. When I reached her I said, "Hello, Marta." She said, "Ingrid." "Just that." I said, "You sent the invitation?" She looked at me. "My mother sent it." I nodded. I didn't say anything else. She stepped slightly to the side and I walked the girls through the door. The lodge interior was warm and arranged with the precision of a Renata Halvorsen event. Cream linens, low flowers, small place cards in cream envelopes at each seat. I found the seating chart near the door and located our names. We had been placed at a round table near the back of the reception area, partially screened by a potted arrangement of evergreen branches. I noted this without reacting to it. I settled the girls at our table. I gave Britt the small bag of quiet activities I'd packed, a pad of paper, 3 colored pencils, a folded ferry schedule she liked to look at because of the boat diagrams. I gave Signa a small book. Lena arranged her boat key on the tablecloth in front of her and studied the room. My tote bag went on the floor beside my chair, the folder still inside it, still flat, still closed. I hadn't decided yet when or whether. I only knew it would come out if it needed to. The ceremony was short. I watched it from our table. The wedding was outdoors but guests were visible through the tall windows, and the sound came through clearly. Daniel stood at the front with his hands clasped. I couldn't see his face well from that distance. His new wife was fair-haired, young, composed. They exchanged vows in the clear way that people do when they've rehearsed them. I watched. I felt very little, and what I felt was not what I might have expected. It was closer to recognition. This was Daniel's life now. It was arranged and composed and carefully managed. That was accurate. I thought, watching him say his vows about the night Brit spiked a fever of 104 and I'd called the after-hours line 3 times before a doctor called back, and I'd sat on the bathroom floor with her wrapped in a cool towel for 2 hours because that was what the nurse on the line told me to do, and I hadn't called anyone else because there was no one else to call. I thought about the morning I'd had to choose between a Hull survey worth $1,100 and Cigna's molar coming in wrong, and I'd rescheduled the survey and lost the client to another firm, and never told anyone that either. None of that belonged in this room. I filed it away the way I filed everything and kept watching the ceremony. The reception moved inside. I stayed at our table. The girls had settled into their activities, Brit drawing, Cigna reading, Lena watching the room with the boat key in her fist. A server brought bread rolls and water. I poured water for each of the girls. I ate a roll. I waited. The room filled slowly around us. I recognized a few faces from the years I'd spent at Halvorsen family gatherings, an aunt of Renata's who'd once complimented my chowder and then never spoken to me again, a cousin of Gerald's who worked in shipping insurance and had talked to Daniel and me for 40 minutes about container rates at our own wedding. None of them approached. A few glanced at our table at the 3 small girls in matching gray dresses and looked away again quickly, the way people look away from something they suspect they aren't supposed to have seen yet. I understood that too. Whatever this room already knew or didn't know, it was working it out in real time, table by table, glance by glance. Renata found me 20 minutes into the cocktail hour. She came across the room at a measured pace, not hurrying, not hesitating. She was 71 now, and she looked it in the way that women who have always controlled their environments look their age, deliberately, without apology. She wore a deep blue dress and her silver hair was pinned. She looked at the girls before she looked at me. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Ingrid," she said. "Renata," I said. She sat down across from me. She didn't ask permission. She looked at the girls again one by one and something moved behind her eyes that I didn't name. She said, "They're beautiful." I said, "Thank you." She said, "How old?" 4.5, I said. She looked at each of them again, slower this time, the way she used to inspect a table setting before guests arrived, checking for what was out of place. "Which is which?" "Cigna, Brit, Lena," I said in order, left to right. "Halvorsen names," she said. "Or did you give them your own?" "Halvorsen," I said. It seemed right at the time. She absorbed that. She looked at Lena's boat key without commenting on it yet. Then she looked back at me. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He doesn't know." It wasn't a question. I said no. She pressed her lips together. Then she looked at me directly and said, "You should have told him." I didn't answer. She said it again more quietly. "You should have told him, Ingrid. He had a right to know." I kept my voice even. "We can disagree about that." "It wasn't a question of disagreement," she said. "These are his children." "These are my children," I said. She looked at me steadily. Her expression didn't shift to anger, not exactly. It was something more measured. She said, "You've always had a way of making things about ownership." I said nothing. She said, "I understand you were hurt. I understand the divorce was difficult. But what you've done, keeping them from him, keeping them from this family, that's not something a person does unless they want to cause pain." I let the silence hold. She leaned forward slightly. Her voice was even, almost gentle. "You came here today with these 3 little girls in their good dresses, and I want to believe it was because you wanted to do the right thing. Finally. But I'm looking at you and I'm not sure." I kept my voice even. "What are you not sure about?" "I'm not sure," she said, "that you're here for them. I think you're here for yourself." My throat went tight. She settled back. She smoothed the tablecloth in front of her with one hand. "You were always like that. Even during the marriage. Everything was your project. Your work, your house, your schedule. Daniel couldn't breathe inside that." I said, "Is that what he told you?" She said, "He didn't have to tell me. I watched it for 4 years." I said nothing. She said, "I'm not trying to be unkind." I said, "I know. But I think you owe this family an honest conversation. You owe Daniel one. You owe these girls one eventually." She looked at Lena, who was watching her with the specific attention that Lena brought to things she found interesting. "What is she holding?" "A boat key," I said. Renata looked at it for a moment. Then back at me. Ingrid, she said, I sent you that invitation because I thought you'd grown. I thought enough time had passed. I hoped that you might come here and make something right. She paused. I'm not sure that's what's happening. I didn't answer. She said, you took yourself out of this family. That was your choice. But you took them too. She gestured toward the girls with one hand, the smallest motion, controlled and precise. And that was not your choice to make alone. I kept my voice even. You didn't contact me. For 4.5 years. She said, we didn't know. I said, Marta knew. A pause. Brief but real. She said, Marta told me recently. I said, she knew within a year of them being born. Renata's jaw tightened. She said nothing for a moment. Then, that's a conversation I'll have with Marta. I said, all right. She should have told me the day she found out, Renata said. Instead I've been carrying this for, how long has she known? 3 years at least. Maybe longer. And in 3 years no one in this family so much as sent a birthday card. No, I said. No one did. She looked briefly toward the door where Marta was still stationed with her clipboard, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. She turned back to me. I want you to understand, she said, that I am not the villain of whatever story you've built in your head over 4 years. I haven't built a story, I said. I've built a record. There's a difference. Is there? A record doesn't need me to be right. It only needs to be accurate. Renata was quiet at that, longer than she'd been quiet for anything else I'd said. When she spoke again her voice had lost some of its edge. You were always better at that than I was. Being accurate instead of being right. I don't think those have to be different things, I said. They are more often than you'd like, she said. She absorbed that the way she absorbed most things she didn't like, without visible reaction, filing it somewhere for later. Then she looked at me. Are you going to make this into a confrontation? I said no. She said good. Because today is Daniel's day. Whatever you came here to accomplish, I'm asking you to remember that. I said, I remember. She looked at the girls again. Then back at me. Have you thought about what you're going to say to him? I said, I've thought about it. And? I said, I'll say what's true. She nodded slowly. And what is true in your view? I said, that these are his daughters. That they exist. That they're healthy and whole. That I raised them without asking anything of anyone. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you always needed people to know how much you'd done. My stomach dropped. I kept my voice even. I kept records, I said. That's different. She said, is it? I said, yes. She pressed her lips together again. She looked at Britt's drawing on the pad of paper. She looked at Signa's book. She looked at Lena's boat key laid out on the white tablecloth. Then she looked at me. She looked past me briefly toward the head table, then back. Does he know you kept records? The kind of records. No one knows what I kept, I said. Until today, if it comes to that. You brought something with you. I didn't answer that directly. I said, I came prepared for a conversation if one was needed. That's not an answer. It's the one I'm giving you, I said. She studied me for a moment, the way she used to study a place setting for what didn't belong. Then she folded her hands on the table. She said, I'm going to ask you something and I'd like an honest answer. I said, all right. She said, did you come here today to hurt him? I didn't answer immediately. She said, because if you did, I'd like you to consider leaving before he sees you. Before this goes further. I said, I'm not going to leave. She said, Ingrid. I said, I'm not going to leave Renata. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stood. She smoothed her dress. She said, I hope you know what you're doing. I said, I usually do. She left without looking back. I sat very still. Britt had stopped drawing. She was watching me. Mama, she said. Is that lady coming back? I said, I don't know. She went back to her drawing. I drank some water. I looked at the room. People were moving through the cocktail hour, plates and glasses, the low sound of conversation. I could hear the water outside through the tall windows. A fairy horn far off. I felt the strap of my tote bag against my ankle where I'd looped it around the chair leg, out of the girl's reach, out of sight. I didn't touch it. An older woman I didn't recognize passed close to our table, slowed, looked at the girls, then at me, and kept walking without speaking. I understood. Word moves fast in a room like that. I straightened Lena's ribbon where it had drifted and said nothing. Across the room I could see Renata at the edge of the head table, leaning down to say something to Daniel's new mother-in-law, her face composed into the same practiced warmth she'd shown me at the start of our conversation. Nothing in her posture suggested anything had happened. That was her particular skill, and I recognized it because I'd learned a version of it myself out of necessity, the ability to carry something heavy across a room without letting anyone see the weight of it. Gerald found me next. He came less decisively than Renata, slower, stopping twice to speak to other guests. When he reached the table, he stood for a moment looking at the girls before he sat down. He chose the chair beside me, not across, which I noted. He said, "Ingrid." I said, "Gerald." He said, "The girls are yours." It wasn't a question either. I said, "Yes." He looked at Signa. He said, "She has his forehead." I said, "Some." He rubbed his hand over his jaw. He was older, thinner through the face. He said, "Renata spoke to you." I said, "She did." He said, "She doesn't mean," he stopped. Started again. "She's worried about Daniel. Today. She doesn't want today to be," he stopped again. I said, "I understand." He said, "Do you know what's going to happen when he sees you?" I said, "I have a sense." He nodded slowly. He looked at Lena and her boat key. He said, "What's that she's got?" I said, "She found it on the boatyard fence. She's had it 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "She reminds me of someone." I didn't ask who. I thought I could guess, an aunt of his maybe, or Renata herself at some age before I'd known her, before the family had settled into its current shape around her. He said, "I want you to know that we didn't know. About the girls." I said, "I know." He was quiet a moment, looking at his hands. "You did that thing for us. The property dispute. Years ago. I remember." "I never told you what that saved us," he said. "The lawyer said if it had gone the other way we'd have lost the dock easement entirely. You settled in your favor. That's what mattered. You drove Renata to the hospital too. When my heart did what it did. I remember that too. She's never once said thank you for that. Not to your face, I'd guess." "She said it was helpful of me," I said. "About the easement. That was the extent of it." He nodded slowly, like that confirmed something he already suspected. "That's Renata." He was quiet a moment, watching Lena turn the boat key over in her hand. "Does she know his name? Does any of them know they have a father out there somewhere?" "They know I was married once," I said. "They know it didn't work out. Therefore, that's the size of the truth they can hold right now. And when they're older? Then they'll get the rest of it. All of it. I don't intend to manage that story for anyone's comfort." He nodded again, slower this time. "You always did think in stages. Surveys, I mean. You told me once, first pass, then the detailed pass. Some things go faster with a first pass and a detailed pass. I suppose children do too," he said. I said, "I'm not telling you this to collect on it." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you because I want it said once out loud by somebody in this family. You did more for us than we ever did for you." I didn't answer that. He said, "If we had known." I said, "Gerald." He stopped. I said, "I'm not here to have that conversation." He looked at me. "What conversation are you here to have?" I said, "The one that needs to happen." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is there anything I can do?" I said no. He nodded. He sat there another minute, looking at the girls. He reached over briefly and straightened a fork that had drifted out of place at Signa's setting, an old habit, I remembered, the kind of small correction he'd always made without seeming to notice he was making it. Then he stood slowly and put one hand briefly on the back of my chair, not quite on my shoulder, and walked away. After he'd gone, I sat for a while without doing anything in particular. Britt was absorbed in her drawing. Signa had moved on to a second book, one about a lighthouse keeper that I'd packed as a backup. Lena had picked the boat key back up and was turning it over in her fingers, checking its weight, the way she did a dozen times a day without seeming to notice she was doing it. I thought about the ledger at home, the one I updated every quarter, and about how strange it was to sit in a room built entirely around one family's version of a good life while carrying, in a bag at my feet, the complete alternate account of 4.5 years they knew almost nothing about. Ellen's doc permit paperwork. The 4 lien easement filings. The 9 days in the NICU with a Marine survey manual open on my knee. None of it was visible to anyone in this room. That was the nature of the ledger. It didn't ask to be seen. It only asked to be accurate. I checked my phone once, out of habit more than need. No messages. My mother had texted that morning wishing us a safe crossing, nothing more. I put the phone away. A bridesmaid I didn't recognize passed near our table on her way to the restroom, glanced at the girls with open curiosity, and slowed just slightly before a friend called her name from across the room and she moved on. I noted it and let it go. There would be more of that before the day was over. I had accounted for it, the way I accounted for weather delays on a survey day, not with dread, only with the understanding that it was part of the conditions I was working in. Lena tugged my sleeve. "Mama, when do we see the man?" I looked at her. "What man?" "The one from the picture," she said. "The wedding man." I hadn't shown her a picture. I didn't correct her. 4-year-olds built their own logic out of whatever pieces they had. An overheard word, a mother's face at a kitchen window, the simple fact of a wedding invitation with a stranger's name on it. "Soon maybe," I said. "We'll see." She nodded, satisfied with that the way she was satisfied with most answers that didn't ask her to wait too long, and went back to her key. Britt held her drawing up again. She'd finished the rectangle in the corner. It was a folder now, she'd decided, a small brown rectangle with a line down the middle. "That's your bag thing," she said. "The one you don't let us touch." "That's right," I said. "Is it a present?" "No," I said. "It's not a present." "Is it for the wedding man?" I looked at her. She was watching me with the same patient attention she brought to everything, waiting to see if this was one of the questions I'd answer. "Maybe," I said. "We'll see." "What's in it?" "Paperwork," I said. "Boring paperwork." She accepted that with the mild disappointment of a 4-year-old told something is boring, and went back to adding a border around the table. The dinner service began at 12:47 p.m. I settled the girls with their plates. The food was good, salmon, roasted vegetables, small rolls. Signa ate everything. Britt negotiated her vegetables to the edge of the plate. Lena ate steadily and methodically, the boat key moved to beside her plate now, where she could see it. "Mama," Signa said, "is the cake coming?" "After the plates," I said. "How long?" "Not long." She accepted that and went back to her salmon. Britt held up her drawing, the table for small figures at it, a rectangle she was still working on in the corner. "That's us," she said. "I see that," I said. "What's the rectangle?" She considered it. "I don't know yet," she said and kept drawing. I watched the head table. Daniel sat with his new wife, both of them turned toward the guests at their right, talking, laughing at something. He had not seen us yet. We were screened well by the evergreen arrangement. I had chosen seats that allowed me to see him without being immediately visible from his angle. A string trio near the windows played something quiet and unhurried. Servers moved between tables with practiced economy, refilling water, clearing bread plates. The room smelled faintly of cut flowers and roasted rosemary. I ate slowly. I kept one eye on the girls and one on the head table, the way I'd learned to hold 2 things in attention at once, the way I checked a hull for both the obvious damage and the hairline stress fractures that mattered more. At 1:22 p.m. he stood to get a second drink from the bar along the side wall. He turned back toward his table and his eyes passed across the room and stopped. He saw me. He stood very still. His glass was in his hand. The color left his face in a visible, specific way, the way color leaves a face when the body redirects blood internally, a physiological response with nothing theatrical about it. He stood there for 4 seconds. I counted. Then his eyes dropped to the girls. He looked at Signa. At Britt. At Lena with her boat key on the tablecloth. He set his glass down on the nearest surface without looking at it. A groomsman said something to him as he passed and he didn't answer, didn't appear to hear it at all. He walked between 2 round tables, past a server carrying a tray of desserts, past a child chasing a balloon that had come loose from a centerpiece, and none of it seemed to register on his face. His eyes stayed on the 3 girls the whole way across the room. I watched him come. I felt my own pulse, which surprised me. I hadn't expected to feel it, given how long I'd had to prepare for this exact moment. Britt looked up first and saw him coming and went still, sensing something before she understood what. Signa kept reading a beat longer, then noticed Britt's stillness and looked up too. Lena watched him the whole way, the boat key held loosely in her fist, her expression unreadable in the way it always was when she was working something out. I thought, in the seconds it took him to cross the room, about how many ways I had imagined this moment over 4.5 years, in the shower, on long drives to boatyard inspections, at 2 a.m. with a teething child on my shoulder, and how none of the versions I'd imagined had looked anything like this. A converted lodge, a string trio, a balloon drifting loose near the dessert table. 3 girls in gray wool dresses watching a stranger approach with the calm, assessing patience. I had spent years teaching them without meaning to. He stopped a few feet from the table, as if the last few steps required a different kind of decision than the ones before it, the way a person hesitates at the edge of cold water even after deciding to swim. I did not reach for my bag. Daniel reached the table. He stood at the edge of it. He looked at me and his jaw was tight and his face had not gotten its color back. He said, "Ingrid." I said nothing. He said, "What are you?" He stopped. He looked at the girls again. All 3 of them were looking at him now. Britt had her pencil in her hand. Signa had put her book face down on the table. Lena was watching him with the navigator's attention she gave to new things. He said, "Are they?" He didn't finish the sentence. I said, "Yes." He stood very still. He said, "How old?" I said, 4.5. He looked at me. His voice was low. "You never told me." I said, "No." He said, "Ingrid." He stopped. His throat moved. He said, I got married today. I have a wife." "I have." He stopped. I said, "I know." He said, "Why are you here?" I said, "Your mother invited me." He looked at me. "My mother knew?" I said, "She knew enough." He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. The girls watched him. Lena picked up her boat key. He said very quietly, "I don't understand what you want." I said, "I don't want anything from you." He said, "Then why?" I said, "Because they exist. And you didn't know. And I decided you should." He looked at the girls again, one by one, the specific involuntary attention of a person seeing something they weren't prepared for. He looked at Signa's forehead. He looked at Britt's hands. He looked at Lena's boat key. He said, "They're mine." I said, "They're mine." "But yes." He put his hand over his mouth. He sat like that for a moment. I reached down into the bag at my feet. I found the folder by feel under the snack bag, exactly where it had sat since that morning. I slid it across the tablecloth to him. I left it closed. The room continued around us. Plates moved. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed at the head table. The afternoon light came through the tall windows at a low angle and lay across the tablecloth. I poured water for Britt. I straightened Signa's napkin. I watched Lena trace the edge of her boat key with one small finger, patient and deliberate. Daniel sat across from me with the folder under his hand. I waited. Britt finished her salmon. Signa looked at her book and then at the window. Lena held the boat key and looked at Daniel with the steady attention she brought to things she was trying to understand. I folded my hands in my lap. I did not look at the head table. I did not look at the door. I looked at the folder. Daniel didn't open the folder. He sat with his hand resting on it and looked at me. His face had settled into something controlled, the way a face settles when the first wave of shock has passed and what remains is the effort of management. He said, "I need you to tell me what's in here." I said, "Open it." He said, "Ingrid." I said, "Open it, Daniel." He looked at the girls. Lena was watching him. Britt had gone back to her drawing, though her pencil wasn't moving. Signa had her hands folded on the table in front of her, patient. He said, "Not here." I said, "Here is fine." He said, "There are people." I said, "I know." He looked at the folder. He looked at me. He said, "Did my mother know what was in this?" I said, "No." He said, "Did she know you were going to bring it?" I said, "She knew I might have something to say to you. She asked me not to say it today." His jaw tightened. He said, "Then why?" I said, "Because I drove 2 hours on a ferry with 3 4-year-old girls in their good dresses, and I am not going to schedule a separate appointment." He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face that I didn't name. He opened the folder. The first page was Signa's birth certificate. He looked at it for a long time. His eyes moved across it slowly. Name. Date. Mother. Father listed as unknown because that was what I had written, because he had not been there and I had not known at the time whether I would ever tell him. He turned to the second page. Brit's certificate. Then Lena's. He set them side by side on the table and looked at all three. He said, "You wrote unknown." I said, "Yes." He said, "For all three." I said, "Yes." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because you weren't there." He looked up at me. His voice was very quiet. "I would have been there." I said, "You weren't." He said, "You didn't tell me." I said, "I know." He looked back at the certificates. He turned to the next page. It was the expense summary. I had formatted it cleanly the way I format survey documentation, categories, line items, totals. 4.5 years of costs, organized by quarter. Medical. Childcare. Housing. Transportation. Clothing. Incidentals. The fence repair. The water heater. The van. The total at the bottom was just under $340,000. He looked at it for a long time. He said, "You kept all of this." I said, "I keep records. It's my practice." He said, $340,000. I said, "Approximate." He said, "You did this alone." I said, "Yes." He turned to the next page. The county property filings, one for each girl, the small accounts I'd opened in their names. He read those slowly too. He set the folder down. He looked at the girls again and the color had come back into his face, but it was a different color now, something darker around his eyes. He said, "I would have helped." I said, "I didn't ask." He said, "You should have told me." I said, "We've established that you feel that way." He said, "Ingrid, they're my daughters." I said, "They're my daughters who are also yours, yes." He pressed his hand flat on the table. He said, "What do you want me to do with this?" I said, "I don't want you to do anything with it today. Today is your wedding." He looked at me. "Then why?" I said, "Because you deserve to know the truth of your own life. And because they deserve a father who knows they exist. What you do with that is yours to decide." He sat back. He looked at the folder. He looked at the 3 certificates laid side by side. He said, "I have a wife." I said, "I know." He said, "I didn't know about them. She doesn't know." I said, "That's a conversation you'll need to have." He said, "Today." I said, "I imagine so." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Open them." He said, "Did you plan this? Coming here today, all of this, did you plan it to happen at the wedding?" I said, "Your mother sent the invitation." He said, "That's not what I asked." I said, "I brought the folder because I bring documentation when I assess a situation and documentation seems likely to be needed. I didn't plan the timing. Your mother planned the timing." He looked at me. "She didn't know what you had?" I said no. "But she knew enough to invite me. She knew enough to write that she wanted the children to come." I paused. "She used the word children. She didn't say your children. She said the children. Like she'd been thinking about them as a category for a long time." He was quiet. I said, "I think she knew more than she told you. I think she's been knowing more than she told you for quite a while." He said nothing. I said, "That's also a conversation you'll need to have." He looked at the folder again. He said, "Can I keep this?" I said, "I made it for you." He picked up the 3 birth certificates and held them in both hands, looking at them. Signa watched him. Lena had her boat key in her fist again. His new wife appeared at the edge of the table. She had come quietly, the way people come when they've been watching something from a distance and have decided they can't stay back any longer. She was fair-haired and composed, and her composure was working hard. She looked at Daniel. She looked at the birth certificates in his hands. She looked at the 3 girls in their gray wool dresses. She said, "Daniel." He looked up at her. He said her name. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He said, "I need to explain something." She looked at me. She said, "Who is this?" He said, "This is Ingrid. We were married before." She said, "I know who she is." He said, "These are," he stopped. He looked at the certificates in his hands. He set them on the table and turned them so she could read them. She looked at them. She read them slowly the way he had. Her face went very still. She said, "These are your children." He said, "Yes." She said, "You didn't know." He said, "No." She looked at me. She said, "Did you come here today to do this on purpose?" I said, "I came because I was invited." She looked at Daniel. She said, "Your mother invited her." He said, "Yes." She looked at the folder still open on the table. She looked at Signa, at Britt, at Lena with the boat key. She said, "They're 4." He said, 4.5. She pressed her lips together. She looked at me. She said, "I don't know what you expected to happen today." I said, "I expected Daniel to learn that he has 3 daughters. That's happened." She said, "On his wedding day." I said, "On the day his mother chose to invite me." She looked at Daniel. He was looking at the table. She said, "I need a minute." She stood. She walked back toward the head table without hurrying, her shoulders straight, and I noted that she was composed in the specific way that people are composed when they are saving their reaction for a private room. Daniel sat across from me. He said, "She's going to need." I said, "I know." He said, "This is." I said, "I know." He looked at the girls. Britt had resumed drawing. Signa was reading again. Lena was watching Daniel with the boat key in her lap. He said, "Does she know that I'm her?" I said, "No. They know you're someone I used to know." He said, "What did you tell them about me?" I said, "That you were someone I was married to. That things didn't work out. That it wasn't their fault and it wasn't mine." He was quiet. I said, "Therefore, they don't need more than that yet." He said, "And later?" I said, "Later they'll need whatever is true." He looked at me. "Are you going to let me be in their lives?" I said, "That depends on what you want." He said, "I want." He stopped. He said, "I don't know what I want yet. I just found out I have 3 daughters." I said, "I know." He said, "Give me time." I said, "I've given you 4.5 years. A little more time is fine." He looked at me steadily. He said, "That's not fair." I said, "No. Some of it isn't." He picked up the birth certificates again. He looked at each one. He said, "Signa. Britt. Lena." I said, "Yes." He said, "Scandinavian names." I said, "They're Halvorsons." It seemed right. Something moved across his face that I didn't name. He set the certificates down carefully. He stacked them neatly and put them back in the folder. He closed it. He said, "My mother sent you that invitation knowing what it might start." I said, "She told me she hoped I'd come here to make something right." He said, "Did you?" I said, "I came here to tell you the truth. Whether that makes something right is not for me to decide." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She told you it wasn't your choice to make alone, keeping them from me." I said, "Yes." He said, "She wasn't wrong." I said, "She wasn't entirely wrong." He said, "But she also," he stopped. I said, "She also didn't contact me for 4.5 years. And Martin knew within the first year. And no one reached out." He was very still. I said, "I'm not saying that to score a point. I'm saying it because it's the truth of what happened. You want me to account for my choices. I'm asking you to account for your families." He said, "You're right." I said, "I know." He looked at the girls one more time. He said, "I have to go back to my wife." I said, "Yes." He said, "This isn't over." I said, "No. But today it is." He picked up the folder. He held it in both hands for a moment. He said, "You raised them alone. You kept records of every dollar." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you didn't ask for anything." I said, "No." He said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I didn't need to." He looked at me. He said, "You always needed people to know how capable you were." I said, "You've always needed to believe that's a flaw." He said nothing. I said, "You told me once that I made things into projects. That I needed to manage everything." He said, "I remember." I said, "I kept 3 premature infants alive and healthy for 4.5 years on my own. If that needed managing, I managed it." He said nothing. I said, "And I came here today with documentation because that's who I am. It isn't a character defect." He stood. He held the folder. He looked at the girls one final time, slowly, each of them. He said, I'll call you. I said, I'll answer. He walked back toward his wife. Renata appeared at the edge of my table 3 minutes later. She had seen the exchange. I didn't know how much she'd heard. She stood at the end of the table and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face before, not exactly regret, not exactly acknowledgement, something between them that didn't have a single name. She said, he took the folder. I said, yes. She said, I didn't know what you had in it. I said, I know. She said, I should have. She stopped. I said, you told me I should have told him sooner. That it wasn't my choice to make alone. She said, yes. I said, you've known about these girls for at least 3 years. Marta told you. You didn't reach out. You didn't ask Daniel to reach out. You sent an invitation to a wedding instead. Her jaw tightened. I said, I'm not here to make you feel a specific way about that. I'm telling you because you told me I owe this family honesty and I'm returning that. She said nothing. I said, you told me I always needed people to know how much I'd done. She said, Ingrid. I said, I raised 3 children who are healthy and whole and entirely themselves. If I needed anyone to know that, I needed it honestly. I didn't hide it. She pressed her lips together. I said, and you told me you weren't sure I'd grown. That you hoped enough time had passed. She said nothing. I said, I think you sent that invitation because you wanted something to happen that you couldn't make happen yourself. And I think you hoped it would happen quietly without cost to anyone in this family. I paused. That's not how honest things work. She stood very still. I said, I'm not angry at you. She said, you sound angry. I said, I sound precise. She was quiet. She looked at the girls. She looked at Lena's boat key on the tablecloth. She said, she's been carrying that the whole time. I said, she carries it everywhere. She said, why? I said, she found it on the boatyard fence when she was 2. She decided it was hers and she's been right about that ever since. Something moved across Renata's face. She said, she's like him. I said, she's like herself. Renata looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, I'm sorry I didn't reach out. I said, thank you. She said, I mean it. I said, I know. She said, is there anything? I said, not today. She nodded once. She looked at the girls a final time. She walked away without looking back. I sat at the table with my daughters. The room moved around us, plates cleared, dessert brought out, the low sound of a string quartet beginning. The afternoon light through the tall windows had gone softer, the fog starting to come back and off the water. I could see it at the edge of the glass, thin and white. Britt showed me her drawing. She had drawn the table for figures, a rectangle she identified as the folder, and a small circle she said was the boat key. I said it was very accurate. She said she knew. On our way out, near the door, Marta was still stationed with her clipboard, though the greeting duty had mostly ended by then. She looked at me. She looked at the girls, each of them, longer this time than she had that morning. You knew, I said. It wasn't an accusation. I said it the way I'd say a measurement. I knew, she said. I let the silence hold for a moment. She said, I should have called you. Any of the 3 years. You should have, I said. I didn't know how to start. You start by starting, I said. That's the only way anyone ever does it. She nodded slowly. She looked at Lena's boat key once more. She really has carried that the whole time? Since she was 2, I said. Marta almost smiled, the way she used to at Sunday dinners, cataloging something for later. That's very you, she said. Raising a daughter who decides what's hers and doesn't let go of it. I didn't answer that. There wasn't a clean answer to give. I took the girls' hands, Britt on one side, Signa on the other, Lena walking just ahead with the key swinging on its ribbon, and we went out into the gray afternoon. We took the 4:47 p.m. ferry back. The terminal was busy with late afternoon traffic, families and workers and a youth soccer team in matching jerseys loading onto the lower deck, cleats clacking against the metal ramp. I got the girls settled in their seats on the port side, the same side as the morning, the evergreen shoreline dark and wet in the fading light. Signa fell asleep almost immediately, her head against the window. Britt arranged her coat buttons. Lena sat upright with the boat key in her hand, watching the water as the ferry pulled away from the dock. The fog was coming in faster now, thicker than before. By the time we were 20 minutes out, the shore had disappeared entirely. The water was flat and gray in every direction. The ferry horn sounded once, low, and then again. I sat with my hands in my lap and watched the fog. My bag sat empty of the one thing it had carried all day, lighter than it had been that morning, and I noticed that too, the specific small relief of a thing finally set down. I thought about Daniel in that reception hall, his new wife beside him, the folder in his hands now instead of mine. I thought about the conversation they were having or had not yet found words for. I thought about Renata walking back through the room to wherever Renata went when she had said the last thing she was going to say. I thought about Marta, who had stayed at the door with her clipboard and hadn't spoken to me again after that first exchange. I thought about what Renata had said. You always needed people to know how much you'd done. I thought about it honestly, the way I try to think about things that land with some truth in them. It was partly accurate. I kept records. I documented things. I brought a folder to a wedding. Those were real. And also, I had sat in a NICU for 9 days reading from a Marine Survey manual, and I had gone back to work at 4 weeks because a client needed me, and I had managed a mortgage and 3 car seats and a boatyard fence repair and 4.5 years of fevers and ear infections and beach sand emergencies entirely alone. If some part of me wanted that known, I did not think it was the worst part of me. Lena leaned against my arm. She still had the boat key in her hand. She turned it over once, the way she always did, checking the weight of it, confirming it was still what she knew it was. Then she held it loosely in her lap. It was a plain brass key, the kind used on older outboard motors or small dock gates. It had no tag, no identifying marks. She had found it on the boatyard fence and claimed it with the certainty of someone who knows what belongs to them. She had been 2 years old. She had not been wrong. I reached over and straightened the ribbon where it had twisted at the back of her neck. She didn't look up. She kept watching the fog. I thought, some things you carry because they unlock something you haven't found yet. Some things you carry because the carrying itself is the point. You keep the key. You stay ready. You let the door appear when it appears. I didn't say that to her. She was 4. But I thought it in the quiet fog on the ferry home. I thought too about the folder and about how strange it was that something could occupy so much space in a life. 4.5 years of quarters, ledgers, receipts, filings, and then simply not be in my bag anymore. I had built it without a plan for when I'd use it. Now it was used and gone and the bag was lighter, and I found I didn't know yet what would fill that particular space instead. Maybe nothing needed to. Maybe some things, once carried long enough and set down in the right place, simply stayed set down. We pulled into our terminal at 5:51 p.m. The fog had settled fully over the harbor, and the dock lights were on, amber circles in the gray. I could smell the diesel and the salt and the wet wool of Signa's coat as I lifted her from her seat, still mostly asleep. I got them down the ramp one at a time, Britt holding my hand, Lena walking independently with the boat key swinging on its ribbon. The van was where I'd left it. I loaded them in, buckled 3 car seats, started the engine. The heater came on, ticking as it warmed. Signa stayed asleep. Britt was asleep before we left the parking lot. Lena stayed awake for the whole drive home. She held the boat key in her lap and looked out the window at the dark evergreens passing in the headlights. When I pulled into the driveway, she said, "Mama?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "That man at the wedding. Is he going to come see us?" I said, "Maybe. I don't know yet." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." She got out of the van. She walked to the front door and waited for me, patient as she always was, standing very straight in the porch light, the boat key in her hand. I carried Signa inside, then Britt. I made up the pull-out in the living room for all 3 of them, the way I did when they were tired and didn't want to go upstairs. I tucked them in. I turned off the lamp. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the water below. The fog was thick now, thicker than it had been that morning, the ferry lights just visible, moving slowly across the dark. On the counter, where the invitation had first landed weeks ago, there was nothing now. The folder was gone from my bag, gone from this house, on its way into whatever Daniel decided to do with it. I found I didn't miss the weight of it. I had driven to a wedding and shown 3 children to a man who didn't know he had them, and I had handed him a folder of documentation and spoken plainly, and I had come home. That was the whole of it. I am someone who assesses situations accurately. I have done that my whole life. I have done it in boatyards and harbor offices and hospital waiting rooms and marine insurance disputes and a reception hall in a converted waterfront lodge on my ex-husband's wedding day. The assessment I'd carried into that room had been correct. The documents had said what they said. The facts of a life are the only honest record of it. And the girls were home and asleep, and the fog was on the water, and I had done what I came to do. If this story sat with you, share it with someone who needed to hear it.